Today is Monday, July the 20th, and what we see is a mixture in the markets. We still see the continuing strength of the NASDAQ, up 2.5%, but the S&P and the Dow are laggards, and the shape of their response during the day is totally different. The Dow is really not doing well, and the volume is pretty low, and we're going to see that when we look at the New York Stock Exchange advancers and decliners, because that's where the big deal is. So let's go right to our charts, and here's our oscillator, which ticked down a little bit. It's now just over zero. It's actually 1.09, so it's about as close to zero as you're going to get. So it's neutral. The stacked volume looks like this. Again, the same volume that we saw for Thursday and Friday, pretty much the same profile of advancers and decliners. The volume in the advancers moved up a tiny bit, and the volume in the decliners pretty much the same. This is what it looks like here. The we're looking at the 20-day moving average, which is starting to move up a tiny bit, but not significantly. This is the chart that we took a look at for the first time on Friday. This is what's interesting. Just to recap, we looked at this area here, which preceded the February coronavirus drop, and we saw that on a day when the advancers, number of stocks advancing, and the total volume of the advancing stocks were greater than those for the decliners, we get a score of 2. We get a score of 0 if the decliners lead the advancers and their volume lead the advancing volume. We get a 0. We get a 1 when the advancers lead decliners, but it's the declining volume that exceeds the advancing volume. We saw that on Friday. When we see gaps, these zeros and these ones, we see these gaps start occurring, that's an indicator, that was an indicator, this one time at least, that the market was going to drop. And then we saw the clusters start to build up. The market started to move up again because we got definitely a thicker area of clusters here than we did here. And now we're going to start looking at it here because it is starting to thin out. And now we've had a 1 and we've had a 0. So let's, after 2 days of, after 0, we have a 0, 1, 0, preceded by a 2, and a 0. So they're starting to thin out. And we see that in the advancers and decliners, because the A to D number today was the decliners led advancers and the declining volume led as well. But the markets were up. They were all positive. They were all green. So why were the declining stocks more than the advancing stocks? That's another anomaly that you got to keep your eye on, and it's just an indication that things are not normal below the surface. The Dow Jones touched the 8 EMA for support. The S&P still moving higher above this trend line. The volatility index actually dropped a little bit today, so there's certainly complacency evident there. Apple had an awesome day, 394, up $8.50, 2.2%. So we haven't built a lot of volume up in this area yet, but here's that 161.8% Fibonacci that has been resistance on several days, and it proved to be resistance today. We edged over it just a tiny bit. We'll see what happens tomorrow. Caterpillar pulled back 1.6%, and we expected that because we hit the top range. We exceeded the target of the Gartley, but we did fall into this cone, which is the acceptable range to exceed 1.27 of B to C. We did hit the top of that allowable cone for it to be a real Gartley, and now we've started to pull back, which is something that we expected. Home Depot continues to chug along, but still this it came back to test the double top, and Home Depot could still motor on forward. It's one of the Dow stocks that I think is going to do pretty well. Amazon continues to just blow things out. That's the weekly chart. There's the daily chart. We're going to wrap this up now. Netflix up $9, starting to recover some of its losses after earnings. AT&T was down. The banks, let's take a look at the banks. And the banks were Bank of America up 1.6, Goldman Sachs just neutral, JP Morgan down a little bit, Wells Fargo down 1.5, US Bank down 1.3, and Citicorp flat. So a mixture in the banks, certainly no positive signs there. So where are we going tomorrow? Let's look at the S&P. Still think some people like Mark Cuban said this reminds me of 1990. So just keep an eye on a sudden change in the currents. I think it's going to happen suddenly. I don't think we're going to see it tail off slowly. I think we're going to see that when the selling starts, the selling will be pretty fast.